Right, welcome. So my name is Rene, and many of you have seen me yesterday doing the funny bit with the Where's Graham photo shoot. But my day job is not to do photo shoots, but to present training courses on all sorts of standards. And as part of that, we obviously talk about profiling. But this session is not focused on profiling per se, so not on the technical bit of using a thing like Forge to create a profile, but it's more the process of how do I create profiles as a large organization, as a country. And also, as we will see, the process of curating profiles. So if you're a large organization, let's say you're a national standardizations body of sorts, and somebody brings a profile to you, that was not created as part of your own organization, but was created by a third party. Maybe by a hospital, maybe by a vendor. And they just throw it at you and go like, okay, please rubber stamp this. And you're like, okay. So what's the processes that we're currently seeing? What are the best practices, effectively, around the creation and the curation of profiles? Now, being here, you know that we need profiles. There is no way that you can implement FHIR without having profiles. You need to contextualize the specification for use in a specific context. Okay? So there is no way to get away from that. And as Graham says, well, they made simple things simple in FHIR and moved the complexity somewhere else. And where did the complexity go? Well, it did go into the profiling. Okay? So if we see conformance statements and implementation guides as being a mandatory part of any realistic implementable project, we need to talk about the processes and the governance as to how we're going to create and maintain those profiles. So in general, if you look at the governance, we're going to look at process and governance is policies around managing the process for the creation of those profiles. So it creates a bit of distance, if you want, between those that actually carry out the process and those that monitor that process and, for example, try to ensure that there is a fair balance between all groups, all stakeholders. And as we will see, this is one of the key things in moving the maturity level of a standard forward, is based on actual implementation, but also on there being proper input from all stakeholders. So as I said, two key processes: creation of FHIR artifacts and the curation of FHIR artifacts, so those that have been created by others. Now I was curious personally as to, well, what would the best practices be for both those things? So the only thing I could effectively do is ask the community, people like you, who work in various settings as vendors or as national bodies, what are you currently using? And try to sort of amalgamate all the best practices from those various approaches into one big picture. Now, when it comes to the creation of artifacts, my thinking was, let's start by looking at how HL7 International actually does this. When they create, well, not profiles, but for example, when they create a new resource, after all, that process is not really different from creating a new profile. So how do they do this? Well, if you put it into one slide, I'm always somebody who's not very interested by text slides, so here we have a diagram, where we see that all artifacts, including profiles, in FHIR have three statuses: draft, active, and retired. So it's certainly true for resource definitions and profiles. And then there is, at the core of the model for the process management, there is a maturity model. Now, I'm now going to look at this from a process perspective, not just from a technical perspective. So in this case, we have 6 maturity levels. Well, actually, there are 5. It's from 0 to 5. And number 6 is when the artifact has gone normative. And so from draft to these levels, there are well-defined criteria as to something changes maturity level to the next level. And this includes things like, well, has it been tested? Have there been prototype implementations? Did it meet our quality assurance guidelines? Do we have multiple production use implementations? So you think so you see that certainly things like quality, implementation are a driver to increase the maturity level of an artifact. Then we have an issue tracker. So the issue tracker is used throughout the life cycle, if you want, of the artifact, be it a profile or a resource definition. And in principle, these issues are resolved relatively quickly. So as soon as somebody creates an issue, in principle, the process will start of resolving those issues. And at certain points in time, you can have a ballot, so a formal ballot to test, basically, the artifacts and the maturity that you have at a particular maturity level. And once you have reached a high level of maturity, in this case number 5, then we have a normative value ballot, and it gets an official stamp. That is a normative artifact. And the issues that are here, that are discovered not as part of a ballot, are given a relatively lower priority than the issues that came up during a ballot. So this sort of summarizes the process that HL7 itself uses. But is that a best practice? So, well, what if we compare this to what some others are doing? First, some details. In terms of governance, HL7 has 2 different groups. There is the day-to-day management group that deals with the issues, etc. And there is the governance board that is sort of one step removed from the day-to-day operations, and they take care of the process management and the stakeholder groups being well presented in the process. Now if I look at HL7 France, one of the HL7 country organizations, then we can see that they have work groups. So their process of creating profiles is done in the work groups, and those are responsible for, well, basically increasing the maturity level up to a normative level. They do have a 5-step process that has been more or less formally defined. But you see that again, it's only a limited number of steps, and it overlaps to some degree with what we saw, what HL7 International wanted to do. But they started a bit earlier on with the requirement definitions, the draft phase. Prior to us creating a draft artifact, we need to have a solid analysis as to what the use cases are, what are the clinical requirements, etc. So they start a bit earlier, if you want, with their maturity process. If you put it into the same diagram, okay, draft, active, retired, then they seem to have these statuses. In this case, draft, stakeholder reviewed, so very explicit review by the stakeholders in a particular domain. If it's a pharmacy model, then it needs to be reviewed by the pharmacy stakeholders. Then it goes to the working group, and the working group does its internal stuff, and then you have a full membership ballot, wide-ranging, and then they have a normative artifact. Okay, so it looks relatively similar to what we saw in the HL7 model, just this is a different maturity model. If we look at Germany, then there's a bit more early in the game. It's a smaller team of people as well, and it's reflected in the process that they are currently using. Effectively, they track issues on GitHub, and each and every issue is discussed on the FHIR Zulip channel. So HL7 Germany just on the Zulip channel, and they actually also vote on the Zulip channel. And there is no normative ballot yet. There is a publication process, and most of these examples that we'll see, they publish their profiles via Simplifier and FHIR.org. Now, a US project, Argonaut. So now we're not looking at an HL7 country organization, but this is an example of, let's say, a more commercial group of vendors that are driving this. And as it says here, they have been relatively flexible. But they have lots of places to log issues. There's an issue tracker again. That seems to be a common theme in all of these processes. And they have sprints. And I explicitly asked them, well, could you explain about these sprints? Because that's not something we have seen in some of the other projects. They told me, well, what they did was to more or less finalize a definition, low maturity level, to use that term, then have a series of sprints, and those are 2 weeks implementation sprints, whereafter they start testing between the participants, and then they discuss the outcomes. Is this mature enough? Are we going to have another sprint, etc. So we see a very short cycle of development and feedback, and each and every sprint effectively increases the maturity level of the artifact. If you look at Australia, again, just all examples. In a few slides we'll be looking at a summary of this. So Australia, again, it's a working group principle, and the idea is always with these work groups in such an organization that those would contain a fair balance of stakeholders. And well, not a lot of governance. There's a lot of organizations that are still embarking on this whole profiling stuff. And that's why feedback on governance is relatively scarce at this point in time. But certainly, the final stages will be formal balloting at some point in time. From New Zealand, we actually don't know a lot yet, because they're still in the process of working jointly with their national standards body on how to describe a process. But David Hay from New Zealand had a very nice slide in one of his previous last final blog posts, where he talks about the process of creating a new FHIR specification. Let's say it's a FHIR profile, and he says, well, the more you move down here, we would probably, as technicians, call that increased maturity level. The more we increase the maturity level, the more FHIR expertise you're going to need. Whereas at the start of doing your requirements, you need much more clinician input. So again, this goes to how do I ensure that we have a fair balance between all stakeholders. And obviously that would start by having a very solid process on the requirements side, and not just on, let's say, the FHIR profiling side, which is also necessary, but we need to have a fair mixture between them. So if you look at the best practices from all of the above, okay, and exchanged with some other groups as well, but that doesn't really matter here. So certainly it seems to be that whether you're in a commercial environment or whether you are in a national standardization body or whatever, it seems to be a good idea to have some sort of maturity model. It doesn't really matter what it is. Okay? It can be similar to HL7, but it has a 7-step model. But that's a complex maturity model for a very complex, large organization. That's not what you're going to use within a small company. That doesn't work. But certainly you need to have certain QA criteria. And HL7 International has defined on the HL7 Wiki a pretty lengthy, pretty exhaustive list of QA criteria. Those apply to new artifacts created by HL7, but they could just as well apply to a profile that is being created or a value set. Okay, so we might as well leverage that particular QA list for your own use. What are your testing events or sprints? Do we have connectathons? Okay, and certainly those are proof that the specification works, and again are mostly something that drives the maturity level forward. Ensuring input from specific stakeholder groups. There are some of these projects that very specifically branch out at some point in time and go like, okay, now you, relevant clinician body, tell me what's the feedback on this. Because they know that by their very nature, these organizations have an overrepresentation of the implementers, the technicians, and an underrepresentation of the clinical stakeholders. So in their process, they explicitly built in sort of a jump out or a branch. Let's make sure we ask, for example, the clinical stakeholders. So use a 24/7 issue tracker, okay, to also facilitate the quick cycles of feedback and resolution. Certainly seems to be something that's very common to all of these processes, and at some point in time freeze some sort of coherent set of artifacts. So if you have a set of stable artifacts that jointly can be used, let's say, in the context of an implementation guide, then that's when you do a freeze. And we know that most vendors like a freeze not 10 times a year, but let's say once a year or twice a year, because you don't want to have too many versions of an implementation guide to deal with. But the maturity cycle is much shorter, obviously, than the freeze cycle, because this could be in terms of weeks, and obviously this could be just once a year or once every 2 years. So governance is just there to monitor and adjust the process if you see that something goes awry, or you learn of new best practices how to best do this, and proper representation of the stakeholders. That's certainly something that we'll have to look at. So if I were to summarize, but now in a graphical depiction, okay, we still have draft, active, and retired artifacts. Again, those could be resources, value sets, profiles, doesn't really matter in the context of FHIR. We need to have some maturity model. Could be anything. But certainly there will be something like draft, and there will be something like normative, production ready, whatever you want to call it. And there's going to be some intermediate stages, alpha, beta, gamma, I don't really care how you call it. And there's going to be some criteria according to which you're going to increase the maturity level. And QA, certainly, sprints, connectathons is going to be one of them. Very important, but only described by some projects, is this initial phase. Before we actually create a draft profile, it's the initial work around what's my use case. Do I create logical models to represent what the clinician actually wants? Am I going to drive this off semi-models or open-air archetypes or that sort of logical modeling? Is that going to be the basis for my process? The 24/7 issue tracker and some formal approval process, even if you're just a vendor environment, so relatively small, you're going to have some point in time where you're going to rubber stamp a document and go like, this is it for the next 2 years, or 1 year, or however long it's going to be. Okay, so that's the process of the creation of artifacts, and once you find out that something needs to be changed, and you have an incompatible breaking change, then obviously that means that you go back and create a new artifact. Because it's not backwards compatible, you need to create an entirely new one. Are there any questions or comments at this point in time on the creation of artifacts? Dunman?
Yeah, so sort of reflecting on the way that's gone in the UK, there's been quite a lot of use case driven creation of artifacts, and that's led to some over specialization, so that something like an organization would have 6 definitions because it's been put in 6 use cases. So I think that there's a case that even before you start that exercise, almost building a data dictionary of agreed common representations for your patients, your organization, and some of the structural data might be quite useful.
Okay. So probably everybody heard that, but I think it's a fair comment that if you are entirely use case driven, then that would lead to large numbers of profiling artifacts, because you create very specific use cases and then you get a very specific profile for it, and you have tons of profiles.
Yeah.
But obviously, yeah, that's doing good analysis of your use cases. Is the scope too small or too wide? But yeah, definitely an issue in this context.
Related to the same question, what he has, like there may be requirements of different contexts. In some case, we need a very specific data, and we may create a very specific profile. In some cases, we may need a bunch of data we analyze, and for example, while we using for analytics, the profile may include all the things the patient's related. Similarly, if, for example, a simple artifact, simple data is needed, some portion of data will be model. So what sort of good practices will be for profile management like this? Some profile may represent a very small data, and that will be also correct according to the context. And for some other context, may include many things that will be also correct. So how someone can...
Good question. I actually didn't specifically look at that. So how do you deal with small scope profiles versus large scoped, and how they are related and included and that sort of stuff. I think the next part will answer your question also in part, but not directly. At least not as you and Dumbbell raised it. Okay, one more and then let's continue, because the next part is intertwined with the topic that we have already seen. The UK process will be shown in the next part. Yes.
Just related to what we just said, we have in Finland a project where we collected a lot of user stories from the field, and we had like hundreds of user stories. And what we did just was that we distilled those into around 10 or 20 like more general use cases that we used as a basis for the creation of our profiles.
Which is exactly what Dunman talked about. To recap, they collected patient stories, a whole bunch of them.
Not patient stories, but user stories. It's like
user stories.
My job development.
Okay. So lots of user stories, and then basically combine those into a more generic and a smaller number of use cases, and use that to drive the further process. Okay. Well, something that Finland, I haven't included anything from Finland in here because probably somebody didn't answer my email. But anyway, let's look at the second aspect, but I'll certainly include this in the future version. The second aspect is the curation of profiles. Okay, what about profiles that are created by somebody else? You're trying to take those on board. Maybe they have profiled something that you had already profiled. Maybe they have profiled something, but it's only for their use case, and then you're taking it on board at the national level, and then we get to the scope issue again. How do we deal with that? So overlapping, duplicating profiles, maybe you should simply refuse them. But what's the process of taking these things on board? When do I accept them and when do I reject them? And again, I need to balance, talking from a governance perspective, the rights and the desires of the party that brings forward the profile to me, and obviously the issues that I have, or the things I want to solve, being the receiving organization, so to speak. So in general, when you look at this, and again in a pictorial fashion, we have one organization, and this organization has its own maturity level in its own process to create a production use artifact. And then it says to organization 2, please accept my artifact and publish as part of your publication. And in general fashion, this organization would go like, boop, okay, so we just get this implementation guide or a profile or whatever it is, and we do our own QA checks, see whether or not in their process they have a good balance of stakeholders, and they determine the new or your own level of maturity. Because they may say that it has been implemented in production, but we did our QA checks and we found lots of issues, so we're going to basically declare it to be an alpha artifact, and it needs more work for us to go back into production. The aim is obviously for both organization 1 as well as organization 2 is that this production use artifact is then used, let's say this is the national level, by, and has to be accepted by this organization. So this organization has to accept the fact that when they bring a profile here, that the answer may actually, or the response may actually be, well, we don't agree, instead we propose that. Okay. So HR7 International, what do they have? Are they a good example in this case? No. Okay. HR7 International is in the habit of, we define everything according to our own rules, and if you create something over there and you throw it to us, we go like, start again. They are, with FHIR, they are starting to think about, this is fresh, this is from last week, where the architectural board, HL7 had such a thing, an architectural board said, oh well, actually, you can. There is governance, there are some processes around this. So somebody can bring material from outside to HL7 International, and a work group will look at it. They would do a QA type of stuff, and then it would go into, be injected into the normal processes. But even here, they explicitly state that if it had been tested and implemented outside of HL7, it doesn't necessarily mean that much. We are still going to determine our own maturity level. If you look at Norway, they're in the process of curation. So HL7 Norway as an organization, they don't define their own profiles. The only thing they do is accept all parties bringing forth profiles and then rubber stamping them effectively. So the only process they have at this point in time is to capture the requirements for something new, apply a checklist to see whether any artifacts already exist, and review. So they will review and feedback of changes and start using the new version of the profile. But there is no governance around this. This is still relatively simple. The most elaborate processes around curation are in the Netherlands and in the UK. So in the Netherlands they have this process, and this is very nice not just from a process standpoint but also from a governance standpoint. So let's say here we have a validation request. So somebody in the Netherlands basically emails a validation request for a new profile or a new implementation guide to HL7 the Netherlands, and that goes to a governance board, and the governance board first checks whether or not this request meets all of the governance level quality criteria. Once it does, then the governance board forwards it to a validation team. That's the hands-on team that actually drives the maturity forward. And they start the process of validating it according to another QA checklist. And once it meets that, you get this very nice green stamp that you can use as a vendor, for example, that, hey, check, I'm HL7 Netherlands profile compliant. Now the nice thing here is not just that they have these QA lists, which I will show you in a minute, but also that if you send a request to HL7 the Netherlands, then it's mandated that you also send a representative to the governance board to be part of that, and you also have to send a representative to the validation team, thus ensuring that this stakeholder who is making this request is also participating in all of the discussions. But also, in future discussions, if some other party now sends a request, then the ones from the previous request are still in these both teams. So it's an automated process to enlarge the stakeholder group over time. It's a very smart thing that they've actually created there. So you have the governance board, and again a validation team, so a separation between concerns, governance versus the execution of the process. So the governance board has these checklists, or this checklist, and no, I did not do the capitalization, that was already there. So there are lots of requirements here as to the request has to basically comply to all of this, and otherwise the request simply won't be accepted. The validation team, so this is a more technical execution of the whole validation that they are thinking of. Well, is there consistency? Is there overlap with existing profiles? Are there similar use cases? And so this is the part where your scoping issue raised by you both will show up. Okay? But to have examples, always a good thing to require. Now if you look at the UK, then the UK has an organization called Interopen, which is basically a grouping, my words, it's a grouping of various stakeholders, like the NHS in England, Code for Health, the Professional Record Standards Body, it's effectively a clinician body, HL7 UK is also part of that. So you already have a requirement for some harmonization, some curation of profiles within that particular group. It's probably best shown using an upcoming slide. Here we have this very explicit branch out within the process, within the curation process. Let's go out to this PRSB clinician body and let's get their feedback. Okay, so it's built into the process to actually get this PRSB to provide feedback on the various models. From a process perspective, this is more of a GitHub diagram. This is actually HL7 UK. Okay, this line, and HL7 UK, when there is a new project or a new request to make changes for other organizations represented by these lines, then they create a feature branch, and there may be other feature branches on top of that, and then they're sort of merged back into the main branch, and that's the point where you get the clinicians to review and where the ballot takes place. So HL7 UK functions as the, well, coordinating organization, more or less.
Would you like an update on that?
No.
No. Just
at least
slightly out of date currently.
Okay. Well, this was on the website.
That's right. Yeah, we're probably going to move some of that green box at the bottom right up into the stuff at the top left, just so that we have to do less.
That always sounds good. So there already have been some changes again. Yes. I have to keep abreast of this. So to put it into this slide again, just to show you how would this fit within our, let's say, reference picture. We still have draft active retired, we have HL7 UK, and we have a number of other organizations. So you get HL7 UK to create this feature branch and to drive the issue tracker. Then you get the other organizations to increase the maturity level, and then effectively it goes back to HL7 UK, review by clinical stakeholders, followed by a normative spec based on the full membership ballot. It's a bit of to and froing. But this summary probably still holds, right? I'm looking at HL7 UK here.
I think we're probably moving towards more of a curation approach from this early aspiration.
Okay. I think it's probably more realistic to do curation, but anyway.
Yeah.
Interesting feature. This is came up again last week, I think, where it's not just the process of the support doesn't stop here. Here's the normative artifact, go build this. But the NHS actually has created an API lab, which also has the aim to provide software toolkits, API toolkits, that are specific to the UK profiles. If you want to make it easy for people to implement profiles, you might as well create an API just for those profiles. Not a generic API, but one that's specific to those profiles. And it's going to be open source, and there's going to be a test lab online, so again, that's to drive implementation, but that's post-publication if you want. So talking about best practices, well, certainly ensure participation of those that are proposing something with those that are accepting a profile. So the HL7 international model is, well, we'll accept your artifact, and then to you it will be a black box, we'll do our own thing, and then we'll tell you the outcome. I don't think that stakeholder who brings it forward is going to be very happy with that, unless they're somehow sitting at the table. So, do you want to do co-development? Get involved early, or, as Duna now says that the HL7 UK is moving, curate a final version. So we're just going to sit and wait until they're done, accept their final version, and just give them yes or no as an answer, more or less, or give them a modified version. It's probably easier, obviously, just to curate. Obviously, if you accept something, you may accept something that has a different scope than what was originally brought forward. If a vendor in a certain niche has a very niche use case and they bring forward a profile, I may wish to, at the national level, define a wider scoping profile and then send that back to the vendor, and they can create a profile of our profile. if they really want to. Okay, so to summarize, and we're coming up to the last few minutes of the presentation anyway. Best practices around curation. Yes, you're going to have your own life cycle, your own maturity level. You create a production use artifact, although both organizations may be jointly involved in this process as well, but let's assume they drive it up to production use. UA checks, you define your own maturity level based on inputs that you receive. You have a production use artifact on this side, which may differ from the one that was brought to us, and you bring that back to this party. More or less, they have to commit when they send it to us that they're going to accept our ruling, whatever it's going to be. In terms of governance, get both parties involved, and curation obviously is easier when you already have prior knowledge. When you have co-developed this stuff, it's easy to determine whether it's going to fit or not. Whereas if somebody has been working on it for 2 years and they throw it at you and you've never heard of it, chances are going to be reasonably large that you're going to have some issues. Okay, so creation of artifacts, creation of profiles versus curation of profiles. And some of these groups, as you have seen, do both. They're closely intertwined, but yeah, different processes. So I hope you've seen the highlights of the processes and have gleaned a bit of the best practices. It's early days yet as to how everybody's doing this, and they're still changing it as they go along. But I hope you have a bit of an idea as to how both are working. Anything right now? And if not, then enjoy the rest of your day. And with my other hat on, don't forget to take the Where's Graham poster home tomorrow before you leave. It will be at the registration desk. So, see you around and enjoy the rest of the conference.